So thanks for inviting me, and I have to say, when Pam invited me, I said, Pam, I would love to come, but I haven't really done anything around violence. And then Pam said, we are mostly interested in your approaches to research, which we can also use in addressing issues around violence. So what I have arranged for today is to talk about these three theoretical approaches and show some examples from my work, how I have used these three approaches in researching women's lives, really. And then at the end of the presentation, I have three suggestions on how these approaches could be used for research in violence. So I hope it will work. That's how I designed it. So we start with this idea of what it means to research the lives of others. And this question has been at the heart of my research since my PhD years, and has been going on till today. In addressing this topic, this question, I have, as we said already, used three theoretical approaches. And when we talk about Foucault, of course, is a huge area. But I am particularly taking the concept from the late Foucault, the notion of technologies of the self, and what it means as an approach to understanding people's lives. The second is from Hannah Arendt, and it is about the power of stories to congeal the force of moments, and through the stories of the moment to create a history of the world and of human beings. And the third comes from Deleuze and Guattari, and it is about the force of desire and affects in giving us some understanding of change, of becomings, of how everything changes and how we can possibly try to understand or analyze this change. So, to go back to the technologies of the self, what is also interesting in these three approaches is that they don't come from feminists. Foucault was not a feminist, Arendt was definitely not a feminist, and Deleuze and Guattari were not feminists either, although feminist-friendly maybe. We will go on, I will show how I have used feminist theorists to both interrogate and also discuss with these three theoretical approaches. But to go back to the theoretical approach, the first one, technologies of the self. As I said, these come from Foucault's late work. In the beginning, when he wrote The History of Madness and The History of Medicine and The Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault was mostly interested in discourse and knowledge in a very abstract way. In the middle of his life and work, through his involvement in the movement against the prisons, he got more interested in power. And we had at this time the Discipline and Punish, and this work where he's mostly interested in how power interferes with discourse. At the end of his life, which of course he didn't know at the time that it was the end of his life, but it was definitely the third phase of his work, he went back to the subject. And he started interrogating the way we become subjects. And what was essential for his approach is that the self is not a substance, but a form. So he came up with this idea of the fold that Deleuze also took up later, that our self is a form and we fold and unfold it through practices. So this is at the heart of this idea of technologies of the self. If the self is not something, a sort of pre-existent substance, but just a form that we can work on, we have to go back to history and look at the history of those practices through which we fold and fold and form the self. So he came up with this idea of the sort of definition of technologies of the self, which permit individuals, he wrote, to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies, souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. So what is also interesting in this idea and this approach about the self is not just that the self is a form, but it's something that can be transformed. And this idea of transformation, Foucault wrote throughout his life, the only reason I start writing a book is to see how it's going to change my thought, to change me, to change the way I understand things. So transformation was at the heart of not just the way he understood the subject, but the way he understood himself and his work. And the world around him. So taking this idea about technologies of the self, we have Leigh Gilmore, who is a feminist, and she used this idea of technologies of the self to put forward the argument of technologies of autobiography, or what she called autobiographics. So what Leigh Gilmore argued in this work is that in the same way that Foucault talked about practices of the self and how we use these practices to transform ourselves, in the same way, this is the same thing that we do when we write autobiographically. And it's not necessary to write a memoir or an autobiography per se, the way we write journals or diaries or even Facebook entries today, or any other kind of autobiographical representation. So what she argued through the notion of autobiographics is that autobiography is a stage where women writers may experiment with reconstructing the various discourses of representation and of ideology in which their subjectivity has been formed. So that was her approach. We should not wonder, she was arguing, whether this autobiography is a true representation of the self or not. That's not the point. The point is how in the act of writing we are actually trying to work with discourses and practices and rewrite ourselves. Instead of writing, we are actually rewriting ourselves, and therefore forming and transforming ourselves. So that was the basis, more or less, but in a summary of my PhD, which became a book later on. So I used these ideas to read women teachers, mostly, autobiographical writings at the turn of the century, looking into how they perceived and indeed changed themselves in education and through education. And I just have an extract here from Clara Collett's unpublished diary that I read at the Modern Records Centre at Warwick. And I have chosen this extract for today because it's really a diary entry where she struggles with herself. I think I'm leaving off being a girl, she writes. The future does not look very bright, and that is a pretty sure sign with me that I am losing the power of building castles. So what had happened is that Clara Collett graduated from the Camden School for Girls. Surprise, surprise, her first job was to be a teacher. So she went to Leicester to be a teacher, and while being a teacher, she decided that actually that was not the life she wanted to have. She came back to London and became the first woman to have an MA in political economy at UCL. So this diary entry is actually written towards the end of her tenure, we could say, at Leicester, where she talks with herself. We have a real staging of these practices and technologies that we talked about before in writing, in the way she perceives herself and reimagines her future as a woman. Okay, then. I try not to, to keep on time, Okay, so that was the first approach, and as I said, it's mostly solidified in my PhD and the book that came out of it. When I was doing my PhD and I was writing this book later on, I was still much more interested in discourses and practices. And although I worked with autobiographical documents, to be quite honest with you, I hadn't thought that Clara Collett was a person who was unique, or I should be interested in writing her biography or understanding her life. I was taking her in a very Foucauldian way as an exemplar for my theoretical explorations. But the truth is that the more I worked and I really engaged with the lives of others, the more I became interested in these others as personas and not as discourses or sites of practices anymore. And because I got more interested in a sort of, I could say, humanistic approach to the subject, I found Hannah Arendt's approach to the understanding of stories and the subject through them very intriguing. So one of the things that I took from Arendt that gripped me from the very beginning is her idea that the story reveals a meaning of what she wrote otherwise would remain the unbearable sequence of sheer happenings. And she wrote this beautiful thing when she was writing her book, Men in Dark Times, where she looked back and reflected upon the totalitarianism in Europe through the lives of 10 men. They were not all men. There were 2 women, Rosa Luxemburg and Karen Bilson. But of course, you know, these things didn't matter for Arendt. So I got very much gripped by this idea that a life is not just an exemplar, as in my previous idea, is something more and maybe something less. And in immersing in Arendt's idea about stories, I also got interested in the way Julia Kristeva, a feminist of the difference par excellence in France, in the late phase of her work as well, got very much interested and reread Arendt. And Kristeva, in a very beautiful book she has written about Arendt, which is called Life is a Narrative, talks about Arendt, and what I chose for a piece of, from her work that I liked very much is where she says, the art of narrative resides, for Arendt of course, in the ability to condense the action into an exemplary moment, to extract it from the continuous flow of time and reveal a who. And this who is revealed through the story is an existential who, of course. It's a unique who-ness, which is not stable or forever. It's the who that appears to each other in the course of acting and speaking together. So this uniqueness of the who is the political who, the who that we can find in the streets, in social movements, in moments of crisis, when people act and speak together, and then through their actions and deeds, as Arendt says, they actually write history through these moments of actions. So that was my approach for Arendt. And apart from Kristeva, who has read and written about Arendt, there is another feminist philosopher who has drawn very much on Arendt's work, and this is Adriana Cavarero. And what Adriana Cavarero has taken from Arendt is this notion of relational narratives. So Cavarero is very much interested in the power of stories to create existential bridges between the listener and the teller. And in putting forward this argument of the importance of relational narratives, she has drawn very much on the autonomous feminist movement in Italy, and particularly women's consciousness-raising groups, and how in the milieu of the group where women stood up and started telling their stories to each other, they created a new milieu of understanding and of analyzing their experience of oppression. So from Cavarero, who reads Arendt, comes this idea of narratability, that all lives are narratable. They can be told in the form of a story, but what this story does is to relate us to others rather than revealing any truth about who we are. Because Cavarero says that the narratable self, it can never be reduced in the content of her story. The self is much more than the story. The story is just this performative act through which we relate. So, in taking this framework, and without having left the idea of technologies, but actually it was enriched by this interest in the who of the story, I did my second project, which was an HRC-funded project on women artists. I will give you an example of how I read through Arendt and Cavarero a very unique autobiographical document that Anna Klamke, a very young American artist, wrote about Rosa Bonheur, perhaps the most famous painter of animals in the 19th century, both men and women. So I give you an example here of how Anna writes the story of roses through their interrelation. She uses first and second person in her autobiography, and her autobiography appears as a memoir of Rosa's, sometimes dialogues that Rosa has with Anna, but also with other women in her lives. And apart from bringing up this notion of relational lives and relational stories, this is also one of the rare memoirs of lesbian love and homosexual women we have overall in the history of autobiography. So now this is Rosa Bonheur speaking through Anna Klamke. Now I know that you will draw me with your pen just as well as with your paintbrush. They were both artists. And Anna, apart from writing the autobiography, she had also painted a portrait for Rosa. And you'll combine your own impressions of me with my life story. Rosa tells Anna. That will be the best way to give the public a true account of how we met and fell in love. So the autobiography is not really about Rosa, it's about the two women and their love, but there is more. It's because you are a woman, because I can open my heart to you with greater trust that I have chosen you to interpret my life for posterity. We also have the realization of how autobiography as a genre of life writing works in terms of posterity and history. And history comes soon after. You'll understand that Natalie was her lifelong partner who had died just before she met Anna, but she brings her in her story. You'll understand that Natalie and my mother were both my guiding stars. You'll know how to say what I mean with all the subtlety that is the privilege of our sex. You are also from America. We also have this European idealization of America in the 19th century. That was written in the very beginning of the 20th century. For a long time now, women over there have enjoyed the exceptionally favorable circumstances that I've always dreamt of for my French sisters. And Rosa Bonheur lived actually in the 19th century when we had this rise of Saint-Simonianism and Fourierism and the first autonomous feminist movement in France. Her father was actually one of those Saint-Simonians who left their families to join the movement. And her mother had actually died from poverty. So Rosa Bonheur at some point says, my father saved the world, but he didn't really mind about saving us. And yet, she herself was a Saint-Simonian, utopian, romantic feminist, who I now read again because the book I'm writing at the moment is about seamstresses in the 19th century France. And I can see their way of reading Rosa. So as you have seen, I have moved very much into understanding the who-ness of the Arendian who-ness and uniqueness of the subject, who, however, this who-ness, as I said in the beginning, is a very political subject. The who that is revealed is the who of the action and of the political movement. And I now move to the third approach that we talked about, that I have called in my work narrative force. And the reason that I have called it narrative force is to mark discontinuity between what we would say, classical narratology, an idea about stories under the Aristotelian tradition of beginning, middle, and end. This idea that stories have sequence and have specific structures, which of course I agree are very interesting approaches when we want to analyze literary stories, stories that have been crafted in advance, but not very useful when we try to understand real-life stories. And the reason is that real-life stories, like all lives, are chaotic, fragmented, contradictory, 50% true and other 60% we don't know what, full of silences and lies. So my approach to narrative, coming from this question, how can we understand life stories, knowing that these are stories that have not been carefully crafted in the way we can understand stories in the literary tradition. And I have followed this idea, which is not mine only, of course. It comes from other people who have worked with post-narratology, and it's this idea of force. So when we work with this notion of force, that comes very much from Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of desire and the idea of affect. I have actually made some suggestions. We move from the idea that narratives represent to the notion that narratives express. From the idea that narratives respond from the idea that narratives represent something to the idea that narratives are in dialogue with the world, so they respond rather than represent. The question of how we can deal with narratives that express the messiness of social realities, the messiness of subjectivities, and the messiness of life. And through all these questions, I have come up with the idea of the nomadic narratable self, so a combination of the nomadic self, which of course has its roots in Rossi Braidotti's work, very much Deleuze, feminist, inspired by Deleuze and Guattari, but who, however, has developed her own idea of nomadism, combined with this notion of the narratable self. So the nomadic narratable self, as I have called it, which is constituted by her desire to tell and listen to her story, but whose subjectivity can never be reducible to the content of the story. So there is too much beyond representation, beyond language, which is expressed through this idea of affect and desire. And that was, as I said, this is another book that comes from this research around women artists. And I have here an extract from Gwen John, a Welsh artist who lived and worked in Paris, who writes a love letter to her mentor and lover, Auguste Rodin. And amongst other things, she tries to understand why she has written those letters to him about her life. They are very rich letters indeed. So she writes, "This was not the reason that I wrote these letters. I don't know all the reasons. Fear was one. I have a great fear of despair, but I got out once I was able to write these letters. I gathered hope in writing them. So this is for me a very good example of how stories express and respond to the world. So she wrote these letters not because she wanted to represent how she felt. She just wrote them because she was afraid and she didn't want to be afraid anymore. So this is the kind of expression that we talked about previously. And another example where again I combine stories with images, and this is one of her very rare watercolor self-portraits. And from these letters, plus from her portrait, I have come up with this idea that we are, ourselves are actually always drafts. Throughout our lives, in one way or another, we draft the self. And every time we change it. As we grow up, as we have new experiences, as we have other auditors, new versions of ourselves come up. And I'm sure we have all felt this, how our self is always a draft. So these are two examples. I have just read the letter that I wrote on Thursday, and after reading it, I realized that this letter has not said anything that I have tried to make it say. It says almost nothing. And she goes on with all these inconclusive letters that never end, always change, and never actually have what is the characteristic of narratives par excellence, the end. We don't have such a thing in life stories. First of all, because when we write them, we are still alive. So the end of the life story is always given after our death. And that's what Arendt has very famously argued. So, to violence and my suggestions. How could possibly these three approaches could be used when we do research around young people and violence? And my first suggestion is that if we go back to Foucault and think about violence through power, which is at the heart of his understanding and theorization anyway, we need to have in mind that although violence for Foucault may be part of certain power relations, in itself the exercise of power is never violent. It's actually the gentle power that is the big problem. The sort of surveillance, disciplinary power, the way we internalize the gaze, the way we become guardians of ourselves. And of course, sometimes in such power relations, we have what Foucault calls regimes of domination, and then violence occurs. But actually, power and violence should not be conflated, and actually power is much more dangerous than violence. So one approach, perhaps, using this notion of power when we interview young people, for example, about violence or about how they understand what they have done, how they see themselves in relation to others, how they make sense of their actions or not. In drawing on Deleuze and Guattari and this idea of affect, force, and power, things become even more complicated. Because Deleuze has argued that sensibility, imagination, memory, and thought all communicate a violence from one to another. So violence for Deleuze is inherent in who we are. And the way, and that's why, and I chose the cry, because the cry is something that Deleuze uses as a metaphor to talk about this eruption of affects, of feelings that we cannot recognize, let alone name or define. As a way that violence is within us. We live with violence, we are violence. So it's not that we are okay and then violence comes and then it's a problem that we have to confront. Violence is an inherent component of who we are and how we relate. And finally, Arendt, of course, and her understanding of violence. Power and violence are opposites, she writes in her famous essay on violence. Where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy. But left to its own course, it ends in power's disappearance. And when she writes this, her essay on violence, Arendt very much refers to Fanon. And she reads Fanon and she rewrites Fanon, and she thinks a lot about Fanon's famous argument that violence is unavoidable. She doesn't reject it, but she says, yes, but if we are left into violence only, then we are destroyed, because violence cannot have any positive outcome, although sometimes it can be necessary, particularly referring, of course, to revolutions. So, and she writes all this while she tries to reflect on the students' movement in the States and in Europe in '68. That's when she wrote her essay. And at her time, she tries to understand young people's violence. She was a very good friend of the family of Combetids. And there are beautiful letters to her to Combedid when he was exiled from France after the '68, where he writes, tell me if you need anything, or, So she engages with this, with problems that we are also engaging with when we talk and try to understand violence and young people today. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I'm sorry if I were in a rush, but yeah. Okay, thanks.